everyone. Welcome to this morning's webinar on commercial real estate matters for doctors and healthcare providers, and in particular, how to negotiate or renegotiate the terms and rental rates in your office lease agreement. I'm Justin Ditkofsky. I'm the Vice President of Healthcare Leasing with Cirrus Consulting Group. I'm sure many of you have heard of us or may be familiar with our firm. However, to give you all a little background on Cirrus Consulting Group, our firm is a healthcare specialized tenant representation firm. And for the better part of 23, almost 24 years now, we have been specializing in advising, counseling, and representing doctors, in particular physicians, dentists, veterinarians, and a wide assortment of healthcare providers on commercial real estate matters. In particular, generally getting involved in tenant representation matters and in particular the negotiations or renegotiations of office lease agreements. On an annual basis, we will review a little over 1,000 commercial lease agreements for healthcare providers throughout North America. Our corporate head office is actually in Toronto, Ontario, Canada. However, our operations are all throughout North America. And every year, we not only analyze and review over 1,000 commercial lease agreements for doctors to ensure that the various financial terms of the agreement are favorable for you as a tenant, but we also get involved in over 500 negotiations where we are actually representing the tenant in the negotiations with their building owner. And obviously, with that being said, we deal with a large group of different building owners and landlords, from smaller, less sophisticated property owners where buildings are family owned and operated, to large institutional landlords and real estate investment trusts and groups. And of course, every negotiation is different, but our focus in every case that we take on is to protect the tenant, ensure the various financial terms of the lease agreement are favorable for you, but also make sure liabilities are limited. And the world of commercial real estate for most business owners, and even more so for most healthcare providers, is quite foreign. And the various legal terms and conditions in the lease agreement can unfortunately expose you as a practice owner and healthcare provider to unnecessary risk and liability. And in many cases, those liabilities can actually pass over to your family and estate, which is part of what we will discuss this morning. In the 23, almost 24 years we've been in business, we have represented over 10,000 doctors in the negotiations of their office lease agreements. And we do lecture quite extensively. We will lecture at about 150 healthcare-specific continuing education courses and programs. We lecture at many of the large provincial, state, and national trade shows and conventions. And really the purpose of our courses, including the purpose of this morning's course, is to really discuss why the lease agreement is important to you, either as a current business owner or future business owner, and also to get a better understanding of the inner workings of commercial real estate to ensure your business is protected, you have long-term stability and security in your space, but also to make sure the terms of the agreement are affordable for you. To give you an idea of the scope of our work, I had our leasing team quickly put this together. This is just to give you an idea of some of the active clients or recent cases that we've completed throughout the U.S. We do a tremendous amount of work all across the country, in particular in many of the major U.S. markets for dentists. So quite a bit of work in New York, Florida, Chicago, Texas, various parts of Illinois actually, Texas, California, but also, really all throughout the Northeast, Midwest, and West Coast. And throughout Canada, we also do quite a bit of work all throughout the country. Again, our corporate head office is in Toronto, so we will actively represent a few hundred doctors and healthcare providers in Toronto or the GTA. We do a tremendous amount of work in the prairies and out west, quite a number of clients we'll take on every year in Alberta, Manitoba, Saskatchewan, British Columbia, as well as on the East Coast. And really, the purpose of today's webinar is threefold. So we do want to discuss, first of all, the importance of the office lease agreement to you as a doctor, medical provider, current or future business owner. We're going to have a discussion on some of the various terms and conditions in the agreement that could have an impact on your long-term plans for the practice, albeit to either purchase or potentially sell your practice in the coming months or coming years. And we'll discuss at a very high level the step-by-step process on how to negotiate or renegotiate the terms and conditions in your office lease agreement. I always like to start just with a fairly general discussion on what is a lease agreement. The reason I put up a check is because, unfortunately, for most tenants, not exclusively doctors or healthcare providers, but for most tenants, when the conversation of what is a lease agreement is present, most tenants will simply look or regard their lease agreement as an agreement that stipulates how much you need to pay your landlord on a monthly or annualized basis. And part of the discussion this morning is to help you all have a better understanding that the lease agreement is far more than simply a contract that outlines your rental obligations or occupancy expenses. While for most practices that is, one of the larger overhead expenses, usually for most practices, the biggest overhead cost is obviously staff wages. Generally, rent is up there in the discussions with sundries and supplies, and is usually one of the larger overhead expenses. However, it is critical and essential that you all understand the lease agreement is far more than simply a contract outlining your financial obligations to your building owner. There are various terms and conditions that, again, can leave you in a relatively vulnerable position in terms of being exposed to unnecessary risk and liabilities. But also the lease agreement is very relevant to the sale and or acquisition of your practice, which again is part of what we will discuss in a few moments. The other part of it is, for many of you who are entering into brand new lease agreements or have a lease agreement coming up for renewal or expiring within the next 12 to 24 months, it is an opportune time to renegotiate the financial aspects of the lease agreement, including base rental rates, operating expenses or triple net costs depending on the way your lease is structured, landlord or tenant inducements in terms of improvement allowances to improve or renovate your office, free rent periods, and so on. And again, it is important, though, that you understand that when it comes to negotiating a commercial lease agreement, it is far more than simply a conversation on rental obligations and requirements and financial aspects of the deal. Now, the reason that the lease agreement is important to you is, for many of you, you may have been practicing in your space for a considerable amount of time and or are entering into a new lease agreement or purchasing a practice. And it's essential that the lease agreement provide you with long-term stability and security. For many of you, you may have arrangements if you're in medical office buildings or even in strip malls or retail centers. Many of you may have arrangements with a pharmacy if they are a tenant in the property. Many physicians across the country have arrangements where the pharmacist is providing some type of rental credit or subsidy that essentially offsets your rental expenses or occupancy costs. And essential that the lease agreement provide you with long-term stability and security, but also discuss the appropriate terms as it relates to those arrangements to give you the predictability that your costs are going to be relatively stable and that that arrangement will not change in a short period of time with very limited to no notice. But again, it is important that you have long-term stability and security in your space, that you're not forced to move unexpectedly, that if your building is sold or being primed for redevelopment, that you have the appropriate terms and conditions in your lease to afford you long-term stability and security in your space. Your lease should also minimize risk and exposure. Unfortunately, for many of the doctors that we speak with, on a weekly, monthly, or annual basis. Many of you are currently practicing under some type of corporate entity, whether it's a professional, a medical professional corporation, or some other entity. However, for many of you, when you signed your lease agreement, you would have likely provided a personal guarantee, either at the time of signing the agreement or during a subsequent renewal or amendment of the agreement. And from experience, we're seeing that probably 2/3, if not 3/4 of doctors are providing personal guarantees in their lease agreements. Personal guarantees essentially implying and meaning that if there were to be some type of legal dispute between you, your property manager, and or property owner, the personal guarantee would allow them to pursue legal actions against you as an individual and personally, which would essentially expose your personal assets as well as the assets of your family and estate to risk under the lease agreement. It's essential that if you did provide a personal guarantee, a number of years ago, that during a renewal of your lease agreement or when the lease agreement, the term of your lease is expiring, that you renegotiate and amend that particular clause to limit liabilities to your family and your estate. And it is very negotiable. It's just a matter of the type of landlord, the situation, and of course every case is different. However, in the interest of minimizing risk and exposure, we do want to ensure that we provide limited to no personal guarantees to limit your liabilities. Your lease agreement should also maximize your flexibility. When we talk about maximizing flexibility, we're talking about having the appropriate terms and conditions to be in a better position to eventually transfer your lease agreement or assign your lease agreement, as it's really referred to another person or party who may be purchasing your practice. Unfortunately, what happens in many cases is the lease agreement is structured in a way where the language discussing the transferability or assignment of your lease, and we will actually discuss in more detail the assignment clause in lease agreements, but in many cases they are designed to be very ambiguous and very landlord-friendly, and putting landlords in a much better position to control the transferability of your lease agreement. But your lease agreement should also have further stipulations to enable you to take on more space if need be, to terminate the lease if need be, if you decide to close the practice, or if there are some type of disputes or issues between you and other partners in the practice. And there's also provisions that will not only minimize risk, but also provide flexibility to your estate. God forbid something were to happen to you. So 23, almost 24 years ago when we founded the company, we created a provision by the name of a death and disability clause. And what a death and disability clause will stipulate is, God forbid something were to happen to you, God forbid you were to pass away, or God forbid you were incapacitated beyond a point that you could practice or continue to practice, your estate would have a number of options incorporated into the lease, including the ability to terminate the lease if need be. That is something that we are adamant that we incorporate and amend into every lease for all of our clients, really in the interest of limiting liabilities and protecting the estate. And lastly, obviously, we want the lease to have fair and affordable financial terms. And when we talk about fair and affordable financial terms, we're talking about rental rates, additional costs such as operating expenses or pass-through costs that the landlord may be passing over to you on a monthly or annual basis. But also, if your lease agreement is coming up for renewal, or again expiring within the next 1 to 2 years, which is frankly an opportune time to renegotiate terms, there is an opportunity to negotiate better rental rates and inducements in terms of free rental periods and allowances to renovate and improve your space. So ideally, if we have all of the above, long-term stability and security, minimized risk and exposure, we have a lease agreement that maximizes flexibility and has fair and affordable financial terms, your lease agreement will start to function more as an asset as opposed to a liability. And as many of you are likely aware, it's becoming more common for medical doctors and physicians to sell their practices. And it's essential that we have lease agreements in place that have the appropriate terms and conditions, financially and legally, to put you in a much better position to sell your practice if that is something you decide to do. when it comes time to determining practice value, and this is just, we'll briefly to touch on this, and I should mention, we are not practice brokers. We do not get involved directly in the sale or acquisition of the practice. However, given the volume of doctors we represent annually, again, 500 plus doctors across North America, we are intimately familiar with the inner workings and the variables associated with the sale or acquisition of a practice. And keeping it relatively simple, of course, we're oversimplifying it a little here. However, when you are having your practice appraised and there's a determination of practice value, there are really three variables at play that will determine the value of your practice. The biggest portion of the valuation of your business is going to be goodwill in terms of the value of charts for your patients. And there's no simple formula on how goodwill or the value of your charts is determined. It's usually based on net income and profits derived by the practice, but there's obviously a number of different formulas and systems in terms of valuation. However, goodwill for the most part will determine the largest portion of the valuation of your business. In addition to that, the value of your equipment will also factor into valuation. And that number is a little bit more detailed and generally a little bit more simple to come to, because the value of equipment is usually based on the depreciated value of your equipment. In other words, how much did you purchase it for? How old is it? How quickly does it depreciate? How often does it? How many years does it take before the equipment becomes obsolete? And the accountant or practice broker determining the value of your practice will actually be able to tell you a specific number as it relates to valuation. Now, what's interesting is in the last, call it year or so, we have actually started to get a lot more involved in practice sales and acquisitions, particularly in the province of Ontario, really not other parts of the country, and frankly not in various parts of the U.S., in terms of really connecting the dots for doctors, helping them determine valuation, and that is one of the services that our healthcare consulting team has recently launched in the last 2 years. And it's really been providing doctors with a tremendous amount of value in terms of determining valuation of their businesses, what an exit strategy may look like. And frankly, it's a new form of income that physicians otherwise would not have had in the last few years, and it is becoming more common these days. So certainly something that we can discuss, but for the purposes of today's webinar, it's really more on the real estate and leasing side. And when we talk about the variables determining practice value, there's of course equipment and goodwill. However, the lease agreement will also factor into valuation. The reason being is, for many of you, when you do sell your practice, in order for there to be a change in control, not just in the business, but in the control of the physical space itself, the lease agreement is generally assigned or transferred from you, the seller, to the purchaser or doctor purchasing your practice. In order for that to occur, there is a formal process you will need to go through with your building owner or property manager, as they will need to consent to an assignment of the lease agreement. Unfortunately, in the various transactions that we have been involved in, what we are seeing is the lease agreement actually ends up being one of the largest obstacles to the sale of the business, either because the building is older and in a position to eventually be redeveloped or sold, and it provides the incoming doctor with less predictability in the space. But in other cases, we're seeing that the landlords are involving themselves, in some cases unreasonably, as it relates to the sale or acquisition of the business and the assignment or transfer of the lease agreement. So this diagram is actually not proportionate. It is important that many of you understand, in many cases, the lease agreement can actually make or break the sale of the practice. Now, there's, again, a number of different ways to sell the business. We could sell charts and close the office and have our patients and charts absorbed with another practice nearby. So there's a number of different variables. However, it is important that you understand that the lease agreement is, in many cases, essential to the sale or acquisition of the practice, and unfortunately, in some cases, can actually jeopardize the sale entirely. As I mentioned earlier, when it comes to negotiating a lease agreement, there are really 4 different concepts at play. There are the economic parts of negotiating the lease agreement, which is rent, annual increases or escalations, triple net expenses or operating expenses that we will pay on a monthly or annual basis, and lastly, inducements in the form of considerations from the landlord, free rental periods, and improvement allowances. There's also protections that we want to incorporate into the lease in terms of having lots of term renewal options to give you that long-term predictability in your space. As it relates to flexibility, we want to have assignment provisions that allow you to transfer or assign your lease if need be, with very limited landlord involvement. And we would want to have a death and disability provision to protect the family and estate. And in terms of mitigating risk and liability, we want to ensure the lease agreement does not contain landlord relocation rights or landlord redevelopment rights or demolition rights, which could leave you in a very vulnerable position if your building is being primed or poised for a redevelopment. The relocation and demolition provisions are particularly challenging items to negotiate, as many property owners are reluctant to rescind those rights. However, in many cases, they are items that can be amended to minimize the risk and liabilities for you as the tenant. Now, in terms of some of the actual terms and conditions in your lease agreement, the option to renew clause is relevant for many of you if your lease agreement is expiring in the next 1 to 2 years or coming up for renewal in the next 1 to 2 years. The option to renew clause is the provision in the lease agreement that discusses your ability as a tenant to renew the lease agreement or renew the term of the lease agreement when the initial term of the lease is expiring. Unfortunately, like many of the other terms and conditions in the lease agreement, these provisions are generally designed to be very landlord-friendly, where they provide the landlord with control over your ability as a tenant to renew the lease, but also may be very ambiguous as it discusses rental rates during that renewal period. So some of you may be reading along as we're going through this, but what you may notice as you go through the renewal option is, in many cases, the option to renew clause is non-transferable, meaning if you were to sell your practice and there was 1 year of remaining term on the lease with the ability to renew the lease for another 5-year period of time, and the incoming doctor purchasing your practice would want to benefit from the 5-year renewal option to have long-term predictability and stability in the space. In many cases, the renewal option is non-transferable and would not actually transfer over to the assignee or person taking over or assuming your space. So it's essential that the renewal options are transferable. There is usually a stipulation that you as the tenant only have the right to renew the lease so long as you are not in default of the lease. Default meaning it could be a delayed or delinquent rental payment, but there are a number of other provisions that could constitute default in your lease agreement. So generally, over a 10-year period of time, many tenants will default on the lease once or twice, usually completely accidentally or unintentionally. It may be that they were away for the holidays, a rent check was delayed, did not arrive at the landlord or property manager's office for a few weeks beyond the actual date or deadline. So it's not unusual for tenants to default on a lease, and it's not a reflection of a poor tenancy, but generally just disorganization within the practice. And unfortunately, if you are ever in default of the lease, it's considered a material breach of the agreement and does actually nullify the renewal options. It goes on to say that you and the landlord will, you as the tenant, have the ability to extend the lease for a period of 5 years or 3 years, depending on the way that you've structured and negotiated that agreement. And it does say, however, that the rental rates during the renewal period will be, and in no event, less than the rent paid in the original term of the lease, meaning regardless of market conditions during a renewal or extension of your lease agreement, the rental rates will increase. However, you may notice that there is no specific percentage or determination of what that rental rate will be, which does leave us in a relatively exposed position. It does actually say towards the end of the option to renew provision that if you and the landlord are unable to agree on a market rent within 60 days of you providing the landlord with notice of your intention to renew the lease, you have the ability to proceed with arbitration. However, the arbitration will be based on the market rent for renewing tenants in the building, meaning if there are tenants in the building paying considerably more than you on a rental rate per square foot rate, which will, of course, skew the averages, the landlord has the right to use that as part of their determination of market rent for renewing tenants in the building. So we're working on a case right now, downtown Toronto, where this medical doctor's been in the building for many years, has no intentions of moving to another property. And the building management group has recently presented this doctor with a letter dictating rental rates during the renewal term and has essentially proposed a 30% increase in rates. In addition to that, the pharmacy that was in the building that was subsidizing part of the rates recently moved out, which means not only are the base rental rates increasing by 30%, but the rental credit and subsidy that was provided by the pharmacy will not exist as of 6 months from now as well. So the point being is when it comes to option to renew provisions, we want it to be very clearly stipulated that we have the ability to exercise these options, we have the ability to transfer these options should we decide to sell the practice. The rental rates are determined, and there is a determination of or a mechanism that will determine how rental rates will be determined based on the fair market rental rates for similar and comparable spaces in the area. There will be a mechanism for arbitration to ensure if there is a dispute between you and the landlord on rental rates that it is very clear what the process is, what the procedure is to make sure that there's a fair and equitable arrangement for everybody. And it's essential, again, that we have the appropriate provisions in the option to renew clause to put you in a position to sell the practice if that is something you are interested in doing or considering doing in the coming months or coming years. When we talk about practice sales and acquisitions, as I mentioned earlier, to be in a position to sell the practice, you do need to have a lease agreement that is transferable or assignable to ensure that the sale or acquisition closes and actually moves forward. The assignment provision you see before you is found in roughly 75% of medical office lease agreements that we review annually, and is generally designed to be very ambiguous and very landlord-friendly. The first notable item as you read along is that if you do intend to assign or sublet your space, you will require consent or approval from the property owner or property manager. Now, that is very common in commercial real estate. Most building owners and property managers want to have control over the tenants in their building. And the way that they do that is by having control over the assignment or transfer of lease provisions in lease agreements. In essence, landlords do not want you as the tenant to be able to freely transfer your lease to anybody you see fit, including presumably people with suspended licenses who cannot practice, people with potentially a criminal background or history, people with a history of bankruptcy. So it is actually perfectly reasonable for landlords to want to have some degree of control over incoming tenants moving into their buildings or assuming lease agreements from existing tenants. However, the way that the assignment clause is structured in most medical office lease agreements, it provides the landlord with almost sole and absolute discretion and control over the assignment of the lease agreement. And the reason that that is an issue is because in many cases, landlords are actually involving themselves in the sale or acquisition of the practice for self-motivated reasons. So we're working on a case right now, actually again in Toronto in the GTA, large institutional landlord, and we were contacted by the physician who is selling her practice. And she's been in the building, again, many years, a few decades, has a doctor who's going to be purchasing her practice and charts and goodwill and so on. And there's a conditional agreement in place between her and this purchaser. She has requested consent from the property manager and building owner to assign the lease agreement to this doctor. And the letter that she forwarded us last week essentially stipulated that the landlord will only consent to an assignment of the lease agreement conditional and predicated on receiving 15%, 15%, of proceeds from the sale of the practice, as well as a further condition that the incoming tenant or assignee also agrees to a 25% increase in rent. Now, you can imagine that if you're selling your practice for a few $100,000 and receive a letter from your landlord advising you that you can only transfer your lease and sell your business predicated on paying them anything, let alone 15% of proceeds, pre-tax proceeds from the sale of the practice, in addition to a 25% increase in your rental expenses and occupancy expenses, which of course will lower valuation of the practice, many of you are going to probably be quite stressed and upset about being in that type of arrangement. Unfortunately, we do see cases like that regularly, particularly as it becomes more commonplace for physicians to sell their practices. So the way that we circumvent a situation like that or protect ourselves from that type of situation is it's essential that we have a properly structured assignment and subletting provision. And the way that we generally structure these clauses is we ensure that the landlord cannot unreasonably withhold, delay, or condition consent to a transfer of a lease agreement or assignment of the lease. We want to ensure that there are no landlord termination or recapture rights. If you had a chance to review the assignment clause on the screen, you'll notice that there is a stipulation that if you simply request consent to transfer or assign your lease, in lieu of granting consent, the landlord has the ability to not only terminate your lease agreement and evict you from the property, they also have the ability to increase your minimum rental rates by 15%. And lastly, if you had a chance to review the very last provision, it does further stipulate even after the landlord has consented to an assignment of your lease, and effectively you have now changed or transferred control of your space to a new person or party, presumably in connection with the sale of your practice, you as the original tenant or assignor, seller or person or party transferring the lease agreement, you will continue to remain jointly and severally liable as a guarantor for the new doctor who has taken over. Now, unfortunately, as I mentioned, 75% of lease agreements that we are reviewing for physicians across the country have assignment clauses that are structured almost verbatim to the one you see before you. And in every case, there is what we refer to as ongoing liability, where the tenant or transferor will remain liable beyond the sale of the business. Now, again, unfortunate, but the good news is this is absolutely negotiable. In fact, everything in commercial real estate is negotiable. It's simply a matter of understanding what to negotiate and secondly, how to negotiate it. So whether we're dealing with institutional landlords or smaller, less sophisticated family-operated properties, most property owners are open to amending and revising assignment and subletting sections, but again, it is essential that you understand what to ask for and how to ask for it. This particular clause is absolutely critical for any of you who are considering or contemplating an eventual sale or acquisition of a practice. Lastly, many of you, roughly half of you, will have a relocation provision in your lease agreement. A relocation provision will provide the landlord with the ability to relocate you to a different unit in the building. This, for many of you who are in medical office buildings, this may not be as much of a concern. This is really more of a concern for those of you who are in retail settings, storefront type units, where landlords want to have the ability to relocate you if a large franchise or anchor tenant is going to move into the building. So unfortunately, half of you will have a relocation provision in your lease agreement. Generally speaking, the landlord is only required to provide you with a very short period of time to effectively move from one unit to another. For many of you, it's 90 days. In some cases, we've seen even 30 days, that you have 30 days to pick up and move, which for many of you is not even enough time to design the new space and get building permits and actually build and design your new office, let alone fully move from one unit to another. In some lease agreements, it may provide you with 6 months notice. However, whatever the notice period may be, it's a major inconvenience and presumably a significant cost that you may need to incur as it relates to moving from one unit to another. In fact, for most relocation rights, it will stipulate that the landlord will incur the physical cost of moving or the cost of the physical relocation of the space. Many tenants will read that and interpret that to mean the landlord is paying for the entire cost of moving you. They're generally very strategic. Most building owners are generally very strategic to put in that they will incur the expenses of the physical relocation, which you can see in subparagraph B under the relocation provision in front of you. Physical relocation meaning they will hire movers. It does not mean that they will incur the cost of leasehold improvements and renovating the space to be ready and prepared for a medical clinic or facility. Lastly, it'll generally have a stipulation that the landlord's costs will be capped at a maximum dollar value. Generally speaking, that dollar value is $1,000. Now, as many of you can appreciate, if you got forced to move, we're talking many thousands of dollars, tens of thousands of dollars for some of you, depending on how large your office is. It could be a six-figure number. So it's essential that we have relocation provisions removed from lease agreements, or at the very least limited, to provide you with the tenant with predictability, to ensure that if you are forced to move, that the unit they move you to is equally as desirable, similar in size and dimension and desirability, that the costs are all incurred by the landlord, that you are not forced to close the practice temporarily while your new office is being built. So there's a number of protections that can be incorporated into the lease. Ideally, we would want to have a provision like this removed from the lease. However, generally speaking, many landlords are unwilling to remove relocation rights. However, they are prepared to amend them to provide you with the tenant with certain protections. So this is one of those provisions that essential also that if you do have it, it is renegotiated and amended. And frankly, if it's not, it can have broader implications on your ability to sell the practice as well. Now, unfortunately, in the interest of time, we only really had an opportunity to discuss 2 or 3 provisions in your lease agreement. It is important that you understand that there are many other terms and conditions in your lease agreement that can leave you in a vulnerable or exposed position from a liability standpoint. And it's essential that all of those terms and conditions are properly negotiated to protect you and limit liabilities for you, your family, and your estate. Now, for those of you who are currently operating under a lease agreement, meaning you've been leasing your space for some time now, it is important to note that if your lease agreement is expiring within the next 12 to 24 months or sooner, you can renegotiate terms with your landlord. However, you do want to start the process as early as possible. We generally recommend starting negotiations 24 months prior to the expiry of your lease agreement, essentially 2 years out. The reason being is the more time you have, the more leverage you have. Unfortunately, what most tenants do, and the common mistake made by most tenants, is they will commence negotiations with only a few months of remaining term on the lease. And what happens in those cases is the landlord will operate under the assumption that you have very limited to no intentions of moving your office, which for many of you, as I'm sure you would agree, you probably don't. And if the landlord is operating under the assumption that regardless of the terms they offer you, you will not relocate your space, there will be very limited leverage that you will have to negotiate favorable terms with them. When it comes to the world of negotiations, it's not simply about understanding what to negotiate and how to negotiate it. It's also about developing and maintaining leverage, which is more of an art than a science. And it requires tenacity, timing the process well, and understanding what your goals and objectives are entering into a negotiation. However, one of the easiest lessons to remember from today's webinar is to start the process 24 months before your lease expires. The more time you have, the better the results will be and the more leverage you will have. Now, in terms of our process, as I mentioned earlier, we will represent a little over 500 doctors and physicians annually across the country. And we will get involved in taking a look at the lease agreement, renegotiating financial and legal terms, and really ensuring that the lease agreement is properly structured once and for all. The diagram you see before you is actually the step-by-step process, essentially our 8-step process when we get retained and get involved in representing our clients. It generally starts off with, we do want to get a copy of your lease agreement, including all supporting documents. Of course, the longer your tenancy, the more documents and supporting documents you will have in terms of amendments and riders and exhibits and extensions and so on. So the first step of our process is to get a copy of the original lease agreement, any subsequent renewals, extensions, amendments, riders, and so on. The second step is to start to identify what are some of your career goals and objectives, because again, every negotiation is different, and it's kind of like a custom tailored suit or gown, right, where it needs to fit your needs, your requirements, and your objectives. So once we've had a chance to get a copy of all of the lease agreement and all supporting documents, we do want at that point to start identifying what are your goals and objectives so we can start customizing our strategy based on what you are looking to accomplish. The third step of our process is to review everything thoroughly cover to cover. And this is where we have a team of attorneys in-house. Our attorneys will review every part of the document, dot every I and cross every T to make sure every term, condition, and potential liability is identified. And it's really at this point that we're starting to develop our strategy for the negotiations. Once we have completed a very thorough review and analysis of your lease agreement, our in-house leasing team will do research on rental rates and comparables. And we have proprietary software that we've developed over the last 20 plus years we've been in business that provides us with access to rental rates and comparable rental rates for pretty much every property across North America. So we can actually take a look at how much you're paying in rent by comparison to going fair market rental rates for your particular area. But in many cases, if we have represented a number of doctors in that particular area, not only can we look at the general rental rate and comparable rental rates for the area, we can actually look at what some of the other practices nearby are paying, what type of agreements they have with pharmacies, or what type of rental subsidy agreements they may have, to essentially compare apples to apples to help you and advise you accordingly whether or not you have a good deal financially. Once we've completed all of our market research, we will then generally get on a call with our clients before we engage in formal negotiations with the landlord to essentially go over our findings with you in terms of the various risks that we've identified in your lease agreement, the various financial terms in your lease agreement that merit negotiations, either that are over or above market. And it's really here where, as a group with our clients, we develop strategy. It's always important for on our end that it's a much more customized and personalized approach to entering into a negotiation so that the expectations are set, the goals are very clear, and we are all aligned to ensure that we are going down a path, a treatment plan to ensure the lease is properly negotiated once and for all. When we do formally commence negotiations with the landlord, one thing that is critical is that it is an extremely friendly, professional, and cordial conversation. A lot of people fail in negotiations by being overly aggressive, not being friendly, professional, courteous, and so on. And landlords generally prefer to deal with people who are friendly and professional and know what they're doing. So when we enter into negotiations with the landlord, not only is it a very friendly and professional negotiation, but we always start the conversation with what they actually care to talk about and what they care to discuss, which is generally the financial terms of your lease. We start the conversations on the financial terms of the lease because it's a way for us to induce the landlord to enter into a negotiation. Of course, as you can appreciate, most people don't want to, in general, just don't want to negotiate anything. It's a painfully exhausting process, as I'm sure many of you can appreciate. However, one of our strategies when we do enter into negotiations is to start the conversation with landlords about what landlords care to discuss, which is usually money and financial terms. This is where we're going to have conversations with them about your rental rates by comparison to our findings in terms of fair market rental rates and subsidy arrangements for other practices nearby. This is where we will discuss inducements in the form of free rental periods, tenant improvement allowances to renovate your office, having the landlord do certain repairs and maintenance that may have been an ongoing recurring issue for you that you want addressed once and for all, anything financially related. This is really, at this point of the process, is when it would be discussed with the landlord. The financial negotiations of the lease agreement can be completed in sometimes a matter of a few days or a week or so. And in other cases, and more commonly, it's usually about a 4 to 6 week long process of going back and forth with the building owner and property managers to come to a mutually agreeable arrangement as it relates to the financial parts of the lease. It is, unfortunately, sometimes a painfully exhausting process. However, obviously one of the very important steps of the process. Once the financial aspects of the lease have been negotiated, it's then that we move on to negotiating the various legal terms and conditions and the necessary amendments to your lease to ensure liabilities are limited. The legal negotiations are far more complicated and time-consuming than negotiating the financial parts of the lease. This is usually when the building owner or operator will involve their legal team. The negotiations legally can be as prolonged as a few months of back and forth negotiations. And really our focus here is to limit liabilities, put you in a better position to eventually sell the practice, and ensure the lease is structured once and for all to give you long-term stability, maximize flexibility, enhance your ability to sell the practice, but also protecting you as well as your estate. Once the legal terms have all been negotiated, the building owners will generally send us a copy of the lease, a final copy of the lease with all of our incorporated amendments and revisions for you to execute or sign. Before we advise you to sign the agreement, our legal team will generally review the final form of the agreement to ensure it's consistent with all of the terms and conditions that we had negotiated. And interestingly, of the hundreds of cases we take on a year, it is actually very common for building owners and operators to send us a final copy of the lease agreement that is actually inconsistent with the terms that had been negotiated. In many cases, it may be a very honest error. In other cases, it's the landlord being very strategic and understanding that the negotiation of a lease agreement occurs over a period of months. They're optimistic that certain terms may have been forgotten or overlooked, and they're also optimistic that it's an exhausting process and hoping that you'll simply sign an agreement that may not incorporate all of the terms and conditions that were negotiated. So we spend quite a bit of time reviewing everything at the very end of the process to make sure everything is consistent, everything is in writing, and that the agreement we're signing off on is in fact consistent with everything that was previously negotiated. So in the interest of protecting you, it's important that every step of this process be done properly, strategically, and well to make sure when you do sign off on a lease agreement, it is in fact an agreement that protects you, your family, and your estate. Now, for many of you, some of you may be in the process of looking to start a practice or purchase a practice. Some of you may be in the middle of your career where your lease agreement is expiring or coming up for renewal. Some of you may be thinking about expanding or relocating your facilities, and others, a few of you may be close to retirement and contemplating an eventual sale of your business. Depending on what you're looking to accomplish, the strategy of the negotiations changes. However, in either stage, in any of these stages, it's still absolutely critical that you have a well-structured and properly negotiated lease agreement. To summarize, and some of the key takeaways from today's webinar is to ensure that and understand that the lease agreement can be very costly to you if not properly negotiated. Again, it's not just about rent. It's about minimizing risk, limiting liabilities, and putting yourself in a much better position to eventually sell your practice. It's about being strategic in the negotiations, knowing what to ask for, how to ask for it, and starting the negotiations early. It's also about being prepared. It's very similar to going into any type of medical procedure. The more prepared you are, the more successful the procedure will be. So with that being said, I do want to thank you all for your time. If any of you are interested in having a conversation about your office lease agreement, we do provide a consultation, a complimentary review of your lease agreement for all doctors who attend our webinars. We do normally charge $1,500 as a flat rate to review your lease agreement, identify any risks, liabilities, have our leasing team do research on rental rates and comparable rental rates. And essentially, as our way of thanking you for attending today's webinar, we are offering all of you a complimentary review of your lease agreement. So the $1,500 fee is being waived. The lease review essentially entails we would have you send us a copy of your lease agreement either via email or fax, or if you'd prefer to make a physical copy and courier it to our office, that is perfectly fine as well. We will then schedule a 1-hour consultation with you where we will, in layman's terms, go through your lease agreement, explain to you what are the areas of concern that should be amended. We will have a conversation with you about the various economic and financial parts of your agreement to ensure they are properly negotiated and structured into your lease, and we will help you develop